a trusted voice of truth and light.
God gave me a gift. I shovel well. I shovel very well.
And a rally point for those who've accepted the reality that they are not sheep.
We've got a blind date with destiny.
And it looks like she's ordered the lobster.
This is the Bryan Hyde Show.
Well, hello there and welcome to the show. Hey, I'm very excited because every other week I get to invite my friend Caleb Franz, who is the host of Profiles in Liberty podcast, on this program to talk about, well, history in action. And we've got a great story to share with you today. Caleb, how are you?
I'm doing well, Brian. I am very excited about this week's episode or this week's segment for this, and I think we have a great story to tell people today.
You reminded me as we were preparing for this show that the anniversary of the American Revolution is coming right up, and so I guess the story today has a lot to do with that anniversary.
It does, and I think it actually has a lot to do with sort of the foundation of America in the way that it really should be taught, rather than the way that it's taught today. With the anniversary of the American Revolution, of course, is on April 19th, is when sparks flew at Lexington and Concord, kicking things off in 1775. And the night before, we had a certain midnight ride with an individual named Paul Revere. But what is lesser known is that he was not alone in that ride, and there were actually a few people who rode with him, one in which had a very important role, not just in that night, but also throughout the course of the American Revolution and our early Republic phase.
Okay, so Paul Revere, you're right. That's going to be a very familiar name. What is the name of this other individual who played a pivotal role in that event?
So in episode 2 of episode 3, I should say, in season 2 of my program, I highlighted an individual named Wentworth Cheswell. And Wentworth Cheswell was someone who, if you're from New Hampshire, you might have heard of him. Largely, most people don't know who this person is, but he was actually the black man who rode with Paul Revere on the eve of the American Revolution to warn the area, the immediate area around them, of the impending British invasion. And in fact, while Paul Revere went to go make sure that Sam Adams and John Hancock got out of the area safe to avoid British capture, Wentworth Cheswell actually rode north towards his home of New Hampshire to activate and to call to arms all of the people in their homes, to let them know that the regulars were coming, as he said, instead of not necessarily the British, because they were all British at that time. It was him who actually had up to a third of those involved in the conflict that would follow the next day after Lexington and Concord. Up to a third of the people who were there and engaged were activated by Wentworth Cheswell on that day.
Wow. Dang. I mean, look, it's to a lot of us, okay, that's so far removed. Yeah, but really that was the turning point where at that point they were committed. I mean, when they resisted by force British attempts to, the regulars' attempts to deprive them of arms and ammunition, there was no backtracking from that point, was there?
Yeah, that's right. And he sort of helped solidify that. There were a lot of defeats that the American Army would face in that during that time in the American Revolution. But that day on 1775 would not be one of them. They repealed the British. Of course, they would come back, and it would be a long and turbulent struggle. But Wentworth Cheswell helped to ensure that struggle was going to start off with very strong footing for the United States.
I got to say, that name, Wentworth Cheswell, that is a name made for history books. I mean,
is. Yeah.
I feel cheated that I didn't learn it growing up.
It sounds very very epic in nature. But that's honestly, that I think is kind of the hook into his story. But it's really just the tip of the iceberg here. His story, I think, highlights just how much that from the outset of America's story, it was always meant to be diverse. Last time we touched on Mum Bet, the slave who sued for her freedom and actually won, and sort of set the constitutional precedent for liberty as opposed to slavery. These people were very integral in the American Revolution and in the early foundation of our country, just as much as some of the more well-known, more aristocratic founding fathers. And I constantly kind of went back in the back of my mind thinking, why are these people, not highlighted? Why are we not learning about these people? Because these are amazing people. And to me, I don't know that it's anything nefarious or anything like that, but it certainly doesn't help the notion that America was always meant to be only for white slave owners. And in fact, these people like Mum Bet and these people like Wentworth Cheswell, who was actually George Mason University credits him as being the very first Black elected official in American history. That's something else that, a lot of people might be 1860s, maybe it was the first time that happened. No, it was from the beginning, actually, 100 years earlier, before the Civil War ever happened. And that really kind of spits that narrative in the eye and says that we were not meant to continue this sense of oppression that a lot of people experience. It was a reality, certainly at the time. But the idea of America was about overcoming that reality rather than sustaining it.
So what did he go on to do? I mean, how does his life story end up?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, he was the first Black elected official in American history. And actually, he held that position every year except for 1 year. Every year up until the year of his death, he had some sort of elected official position. He kind of rotated in some ways locally, but he was an elected official. He was a politician. He was a soldier who fought at the Battle of Saratoga in 1777. He actually signed a document called the Association Test, which basically gave support to the delegation in Congress in 1776, saying, yes, vote for independence. And it's something that's often overlooked, but that was an important step in making sure that our independence was secured. And putting his name on that document was just as risky as the individuals in Philadelphia putting their names on the document of the Declaration of Independence. He was New Hampshire's first archaeologist, actually, someone who made sure that the science of archaeology, actually, a lot of it came from him, or he was a forefather of that. And also, he was a local historian that preserved his local history. And all of these things are from someone who was the grandson of a slave, who was one quarter Black himself. And this is something that a lot of us overlook in our history books today, but he certainly shouldn't be.
Gosh, I got to tell you, I'm going to have to keep that name Wentworth in mind as I get grandkids arriving. I'm going to have to suggest to my kids, Wentworth is a pretty amazing name.
Yeah.
I'm surprised that actually more people don't have it. Where could you steer people to learn a little bit more about him?
So, as I mentioned on episode 3 of season 2 of Profiles in Liberty, which just wrapped up, so you can listen to the entire season now. It's all currently available. But that episode is entirely devoted to telling his story and making sure that it gets its proper due diligence.
Okay, this is great. I mean, okay, so you've whet the appetite of the audience here to find out more. Let's tell them where they can find your Profiles in Liberty podcast.
Absolutely. So Profiles in Liberty can be found anywhere where you get your podcasts. It's part of the We Are Libertarians podcast network. And I am well underway currently. The season 2 just wrapped up. I'm well underway currently of writing the scripts for season 3 already. So it's an exciting time and it's a busy time. But there are a lot more stories to tell. And I'm looking forward to telling them.
All right, Caleb, I appreciate you joining me every other week to share these stories. I will have links where people can follow your podcast, and look forward to our next conversation. I look forward to learning a little bit more about the parts of history I didn't know. Thanks again.
Absolutely, Brian. Thanks.
This is the Bryan Hyde Show. This is the Bryan Hyde Show.
Welcome back to the show. If you find value at any level in what you hear on this program or what you find in my show notes, I'd like to ask you to consider supporting my sponsors, or at least reaching out to them and letting them know that their message is reaching your ears. They include GovernYourCrypto.com, the Heather Turner team at Patriot Home Mortgage, LifesavingFood.com, MonticelloCollege.org, SewingAndQuiltingCenter.com, and HSL Ammo.com. So politicians, they really wish that the public would take them as seriously as they take themselves. How do I know this? Well, because I look at the gravity, the incredible somberness with which the January 6th committee is doing its work. And boy, they really want us to believe, this was nothing more than an insurrection, and my goodness, they were going to overthrow the entire government. And I don't believe a word of it. Now, let me make really clear here. There were people who definitely stormed the Capitol, broke windows and coordinated to enter the Capitol without permission. And for purposes, I assume, to disrupt the certification of the Electoral College votes. But I don't believe for a moment that most of the people, the 600 plus people who have been arrested, and some of whom have languished in jail ever since that day, or ever since they were rounded up, I don't believe that they were insurrectionists in the least. I think this is a case of the political elite just really trying to play the victim. And if that sounds cynical, well, I've been watching politics long enough. I've become pretty cynical in anything that politicians do. I don't think they're truthful. I don't think that they operate in the same reality as the rest of the world. And so in their minds, this person won't cooperate, that person won't cooperate, we'll hold them in contempt. And they're making this incredible media spectacle, this melodrama that's determined to cast them as victims, and anyone who questions what they've been doing, by the way, that's a lot of us, at least those of us who are paying attention, as enemies, insurrectionists, people, seditionists. Oh, they're so afraid. I'll give you an example. Did we not just see the Congress pass a law against lynching last week? I mean, they're hailing this as historic, right? It's lynching is now considered a hate crime, and they've passed this brave law, and it's like, wow, well, Jussie Smollett's going to be happy to hear this. Seems like somebody tried to lynch him. Oh wait, that was himself. Guess he could be charged with a hate crime. But think about what they're doing. Think about the action there. Taking someone's life as a lynch mob has never been legal. It's always been an extra legal activity. It's always been wrong. On its face, it's a wrong action. So why pass this? Well, it was because we have to show that we're, standing up for the right things. We're showing how woke we are, right? I have a theory, and this is going to sound a little bit radical, so, please brace yourself. Maybe politicians are worried that as the people catch on to what they have been doing to us, what they are insisting that we do, or else, they're going to get some pushback. In fact, they may actually get enough pushback that people may rise up and march them off to a gallows should that day ever come. Now, I'm not hoping for that kind of thing. I think that would be pretty much the worst thing that's ever happened. Yes, even worse than the war between the states. But I also understand you can't back people into a corner indefinitely. You can't put them in a position where it's, jab or job or whatever else they're doing. And I look at the political class and I think I don't trust them. One of the reasons I don't trust them is because the law always seems to benefit the elites. Got an article here from Kent McManigal. I love Kent's ability to just cut right to the chase. Here's what he says. He says, it's aggravating that New Mexico Supreme Court decided the petitions aimed at possibly holding the New Mexico governor accountable for her COVID overreach were legally invalid. Aggravating but not surprising. His point being that somehow the law always benefits the elite political class and their schemes at the expense of the rest of us and our liberty. So whenever mere people try to hold government accountable and make it stay within its clear boundaries, the state finds a way to brush their concerns aside. It finds those boundaries to be the ridiculous complaints of conspiracy theorists or extremists, even when it doesn't use those precise words. So this time it said the petitions are legally invalid because in their biased opinion there was no crime. How could they have ruled otherwise when they're complicit in the political crimes? That's a good question. When government wants to do something that's clearly illegal, unconstitutional, the courts the government owns and controls nearly always find a way to twist or interpret the Constitution so they can do it. That's what interpreting the Constitution means, bending it away from its main purpose of restraining government just enough to let government get away with a crime, including crimes like COVID shutdowns or mandates, or legislation concerning firearms or other weapons, legislation that isn't allowed in America. Or the crime of government-controlled schools, the issuing or denial of licenses to ration natural rights for a price, patrolling the roads to waylay travelers, or whatever the government was never intended to be allowed to do in America under the U.S. Constitution. And Kent McManigal says this continues until there's no liberty left for the people, but the government has the freedom to do anything it wants. He points out how the benefit of doubt is always given to government interests over those of the people and their liberty, the opposite of how it has to be. Government has been allowed to police itself, a practice that never works with any institution anywhere. It's as though government doesn't realize that when you remove the ability to rein it in by peaceful means, such as petitions, you force the people to use other means. And this won't keep going the way government believes it will. They can only push so far before they've gone too far. And they won't know they've gone too far until it's too late. And he says that won't be a pleasant day for anyone. It will be because the government won't allow the people to tell it no. Now, I realize for some people that's going to sound like, wow, that is such wild idea. I think that is the most rational, clear explanation that I've heard, though. And I think it's also a fair warning. I think the average person, the average citizen, doesn't get up, filled with rage and, spurred on by Donald Trump or talk radio or whatever it is. I don't think they're looking for, a reason to lash out. I think for the most part, we've been pretty accommodating and pretty deferential to what the political class has insisted on forcing on us. But I also acknowledge there's a point where people wake up and say, you can't push us any further. We're not going to go any further. And this is one of the reasons why the Second Amendment, which apparently, is, hey, great news for Ukrainian citizens, but, American politicians, they're very skeptical of the Second Amendment. And I think it's precisely because they recognize that when they have pushed too far, they don't want the citizenry to have the ability to march them off to a noose. Now, I'm thinking after a trial, of course, not just, for the sake of up against the wall, but you get the picture. They don't want us to be able to say no. And for people whose brains have been broken by the system into thinking, but the system, we have to work within the system and stuff. Look, if the system is systematically, sorry, it's kind of redundant. If the system is methodically taking apart your liberties and forcing you into a kind of slavery, or at least obedience to it, from which you have no option, seems to me you ought to be able to withdraw your consent. Now, notice that's not a call for violence. That's just a recognition that there are limits to what government rightly can and should do. And I think the next time that, for instance, a general lockdown or a very restrictive kind of lockdown, a.k.a. Australia, New Zealand, is forced on the American people, whether it be at the local or the national level, I don't think it's going to go well, especially not for the people who are doing the forcing of it. And that's very concerning to me.
This is the Bryan Hyde Show. This is the Bryan Hyde Show.
Hey, welcome back to the show. Please take the time to click on the link in my show notes, the one that's titled lifesavingfood.com. Look, I'm a believer in being prepared. You call me a prepper, I'll take it as a compliment. I think that's actually a very good attitude to have. I also think a lot of people are catching on to this. I think that it's becoming clear that, the instability and volatility in the world looks a lot like it could get very disruptive and very chaotic, and that includes interrupting our food supplies. So to hedge against those kinds of inconveniences or even dangers, as the case may be, would be a really good idea to have some good shelf-stable, like 25-year shelf life food stored. Ways to filter your water, ways to cook. It's all there. Click on the link, lifesavingfood.com, and see for yourself. So let's talk about politicians taking themselves so seriously. I want to share with you an article here from Llewellyn King. It says the political class needs to level with us. Now, I really hope you understand. I'm not trying to generate hatred towards politicians, although I am definitely trying to generate distrust for people who are part of the political class and what they are telling us. I think too many of them really believe their press releases and think, well, they need me, and therefore, I'm above whatever laws govern lesser beings, which is how they see us. They don't understand that their job is to be servants, not masters. And so a lot of them at every level get this master complex and start to behaving like they're the ones cracking the whip on us. If only there was a word for that. Anyway, this article by Llewellyn King. He says there's a rough road ahead for the world, and our political class isn't leveling with us. As Steve Odland, president and CEO of the Conference Board, one of the nation's premier business research organizations, said in a TV interview, inflation will continue at least until 2024 and longer if things continue to deteriorate with the supply chain and the war in Ukraine. Particularly Odland, who serves as a director of General Mills, fears a global food crisis with famine in Africa and many other vulnerable places if Ukrainian farmers don't start seeding spring crops to start this year's harvest. Now, already, Ukraine, known as the world's breadbasket, has cut off exports to make sure there's enough food for their own people as war rages. Odland sees the U.S. inflation continuing at 7 to 8% for several years at best. But his primary worry is global food supplies as countries face a crisis of new and frightening proportions. Now, his second worry is stagflation. If the rate of productivity falls below 3%, then we will have stagflation. This is what Odland told him during a recording of the White House Chronicle on PBS. It's a weekly news and public affairs program Llewellyn King hosts. Odland faults the Federal Reserve for being timid in raising interest rates to counter inflation. But Llewellyn King says, I fault the political class for not leveling with us, and that's both parties. As we're in a state of perpetual election fervor, we're also in a state of perpetual happy talk. Get the rascals out and all will be well when my band of happy angels will fix things. That's what the political class says, and it's a lie. He says, we are in for a long and difficult period, which began with the pandemic that disrupted supply chains and set off inflation, and now the war in Ukraine has compounded that. Supply chains won't magically return to where they were before COVID-19 struck. And more likely, they will have further constrictions because of the war. New supply chains need to be forged, and that will take time. For example, nickel, which is used in batteries that are reshaping the worlds of electricity and transportation and for stainless steel, will have to come from places other than Russia. Now, at present, Russia supplies 20% of the world's voracious appetite for high-purity nickel. Opening new mines and expanding old ones is going to take time. But the world's largest challenge is going to be food. Starvation in many poor countries and high prices at the supermarkets in rich ones, including the United States. Now, there are technological and alternative supply fixes for everything else, but they're going to take time. Food shortages will hit early and will continue while the world's farms adjust. There will be suffering and death from famine. The curtailing of Russian exports will affect the United States in multiple ways, some of which might eventually turn out to be beneficial as the creative muscle is flexed. In the utility industry, someone who's thinking big and boldly is Bryan Hyde, President and CEO of Tri-State Generation and Transmission Association in Denver. Hyde told Digital 360, the weekly webinar that emanates from Texas State University in San Marcos, the challenging problem of electricity storage could be solved not with lithium-ion batteries, but with iron-air batteries. In its simplest form, an iron-air battery harnesses the process of rusting to store electricity. So the process of rusting is used to produce power when it's exposed to oxygen captured on site. To charge the battery, an electric current reverses the process and returns the rust to iron. Now, clearly, as Hyde said, this won't work for electric vehicles because of the weight of iron, but in utility operations, these batteries could offer the possibility of very long drawdown times, not just 4 hours, as with current lithium-ion batteries. And there's plenty of iron stateside. Another Hyde concept is that instead of dealing with all the complexities of transporting hydrogen, it should be stored as ammonia, which is more easily handled. Now, this isn't magical thinking, but it's the kind of thinking that could lead us back to normal someday. And so he says politicians should stop the happy talk and tell us what we're facing. Now, the problem is, there may be a few who will tell us, what's going on. I mean, there's a couple that come to mind. Thomas Massey is one of those who I think, he's not exactly afraid to say what's on his mind. Likewise, I think it's true of Rand Paul. There may be a few others. But generally, the political class, if their mouth is moving, they're lying. Now, having said that, I would welcome the political class actually being straight with us. But I think one of the reasons they don't is because in their minds, we are nothing but little children, right? We're toddlers. And, the grown-ups here have to keep certain things from us because, you just couldn't handle it. They think we'd be out killing each other in the streets, if we were to know the truth. I think the more likely explanation is if we knew the truth, we would turn our backs on them and say, you know what? We'll take care of this. We'll solve this problem, and we don't need your help. And that to them is a fate worse than death. What? I'm irrelevant? How could that be? I've got a link to Llewellyn King's article here. I'd encourage you to take a look at it and see if you don't agree. The political class needs to level with us. I think they do. Now, let's shift gears and talk about why there's so much nonsense on the internet. If you're a person who's seeking truth, and I assume by listening to this program, you're one of those people who's a truth seeker, Thomas Buckley has a very enlightening take on why there's so much internet nonsense. He starts by asking, what does deer hunting have to do with the persistence of internet idiocy? Now, first of all, he says, I'm not a deer hunter. I have no qualms about the practice. I've helped others dress and cook deer, like woodworking or stamp collecting. It was just an activity it was just never an activity that I took up. As for golf, he says, Lord, I wish I hadn't. But unlike golf, deer hunting is pretty necessary now that the populations of historical predator species, cougars or mountain lions or pumas, depending upon where you live, and wolves and such are in many areas too small to maintain local herds at healthy levels. Now, this dearth of predators leads to problematic herds. And until relatively recently, this was not as big an issue as human hunters stepped into assuming the role of predator. But as hunting declined, problems increased as without a limiting predatory force, deer populations became both much larger and much less healthy, especially in isolated groups where inbreeding, deers with question mark shaped antlers and great white spaces on their flanks, really bad if you're trying to blend into the woods, and increased susceptibility to viruses have become so common that government-organized herd cullings have to occur. Well, he says we're having the same problem with ideas and the internet, that without a natural limiting force, even the weakest, most nonsensical notions can thrive. Now, obviously, the past has seen its share of equivalent information expansion events and trends, but the speed at which facts and thoughts and ideas move on the internet destroys the usual predators of bad ideas like nuance or history or research or reason, time to reflect, reliable sourcing and proper context. They were the cougars, the wolves, and the deer hunters of rank stupidity. And just as the natural obstacles to strong rather than willy-nilly growth are removed, the internet removes in large part intentionally, through algorithmic suggestion, those analogous inhibitors, leaving society practically defenseless against the devastating impacts of unstoppable or unsupportable silliness masquerading as factual outrage. Now, I got to tap the brakes here because I am up against a hard break. We'll come back to this article in just a few moments. Look, I see the nonsense on the internet. And by the way, I've learned to just keep scrolling. I don't even bother trying to correct people on things that I find obviously disagreeable. Just keep scrolling. See if you can find something of value. Stay with us. We'll be back in a moment.
This is the Bryan Hyde Show. This is the Bryan Hyde Show.
Welcome back to the show. If you are one of the thousands of people relocating to the Intermountain West right now, first of all, welcome. Welcome to our island of freedom. Secondly, if you're looking for a home, you're going to find it's a pretty hot real estate market. Even with interest rates beginning to inch up, I want you to know that the Heather Turner team at Patriot Home Mortgage is there to help you and make things happen when time is of the essence. Heather has decades of experience. She's really great at what she does. She's also just a great person. And that's why I want to personally recommend her as the mortgage lender you need to talk to. That's the Heather Turner team at Patriot Home Mortgage. You can call Heather at 435-703-4522. Her NMLS ID is 715386. And Patriot Home Mortgage is an equal housing opportunity lender. So I'm sharing this article on why there is so much internet nonsense. Thomas Buckley is the author. I picked this up off AmericanThinker.com. And I like his analogy as natural predators were removed to keep deer herds at healthy sizes. The herds become very inbred. They become susceptible to disease. They become out of control, even destructive. And then, fish and game departments have to mount a culling operation to kill off the excess deer. And I realize that's kind of traumatic for some people. What? They're killing the deer? Oh, Bambi! Well, the same problem is happening with the internet, where there's so much information, and the algorithmic limits that we're going through have eliminated natural inhibitors. And I like the example he gives, like nuance and history and research, things that could put good ideas out there to counter those bad ideas. They're being limited unnaturally. So he says this process is not just limited to the internet, but it's far more noticeable and destructive there. Take the issue of time for reflection, for example, that everyone has while driving back from the restaurant. He says they just had that same moment of, oh, now I know what I should have said when Bill said this. Well, just those few moments of revisiting or rethinking about an idea allow a person how to better grasp or debate the issue properly. But on the internet, those extra minutes just don't exist. Like double-checking with a source you find reliable, or looking to find any historical precedent or not, probing a bit deeper into a statement, or even, God forbid, picking up a book to confirm basic facts. These, until quite recently, ordinary responses to new information and ideas are now entirely out of place in the Twitterverse. Now, he says the strength of a good idea is not necessarily in its inception, but its ability to stand the test of time. Amen. If concepts, either good or bad, are not challenged, they simply float eternally in the ether. The ones that are reasonable, no matter one's personal opinion, will survive the predators, while the ones that are not will die the quick deaths they are meant to. Either way, creating a space or process in which they can all be made to succeed or fall on their own merits is crucial, and that space or process is entirely antithetical to success in the online world. Certain social media services have tried to step in and become the predator by acting as censors by culling the internet. However, those efforts are not only ineffective, but they're actually harmful, since it's the service itself that decides, for lack of a better phrase, what's a deer and what's not a deer, what should be targeted or what should not be targeted. And woe betide anything caught in the crossfire, especially when the definition of deer changes, and changes again, and changes back. He says the organic process of the marketplace of ideas has been replaced by choices made by companies that have a vested financial interest in ensuring that most problematic, most infectious, most viral, if you will, concepts flourish. So web surfers tend not to click on things like everything is fine, the stock market has a good, steady, predictable day, and overwhelming majority say live and let live is a good idea headlines. What survives to the point of profitability is largely facile, purposely irksome or triggering, if you will, meant to encourage immediate continued interaction with whatever service, page, site, app you happen to be using. Another class of idea survivors is equally important, he says, those ideas which have been deemed necessary by the service itself. Now note that the words true or accurate or likely or honest or appropriate are not used, just the word necessary, as in to reach a predefined goal no matter what that may be. From electing Joe Biden to being able to monetize the influencer economy, only creating an end result that directly benefits those involved matters. And that's the most predatory of situations available. If nothing else, Thomas Buckley's giving you some reasons to really question what you hear, what you think about, what you read, especially online. For me, I think the threshold that I look for is when I see a headline and feel an immediate reaction, like, and this may sound juvenile, but I see a headline and it's like, nuh-uh. Here, I'm going to give you an example. Facebook is really good at this, so I'm going to pull up Facebook real quick. And let's just see. In the news feed, it seems like the headlines are always written in such a way to generate that sense of interaction. And sometimes it's, to do it from an adversarial approach. All right, here's CBS News. Inflation will clobber entitled generation of consumers, BlackRock president says. All right, that's not too incendiary. Here we go. Business Insider. 7 videos show the ways Ukrainian fighters are mauling Russia's tanks. There may be some truth there, but I'm telling you, what you're hearing from most mainstream sources, it's a comic book tale and not at all reflective of reality. Wanda Sykes recalls moment Will Smith slapped Chris Rock at the Oscars. Oh, really? Had that happened? I hadn't heard about that. Okay, sorry. Sarcasm off. Here's one from Yahoo Entertainment. Now, this one kind of gets my attention. Joe Rogan says he will quit if podcast becomes a place where he has to walk on eggshells. Yeah, there's more here, but a lot of these headlines are written with the intent of getting you frightened or engaged or here we go, Duggar fans are shocked by the outfit Ginger wore to Jeremiah and Hannah's wedding. Oh, the Daily Tattler. Tell me more. Tell me more. Now, look, I'm not saying that you shouldn't enjoy the occasional escape into, the trivial or the superficial. But if you are a person who's serious about maintaining your grasp on reality, first of all, it does take effort. And in our time and age, you've got to be just a little bit cynical, or at least you've got to be willing to question and not just leap onto the bandwagon and start chanting in unison with what everybody else is saying. I found it personally to be a very good habit when something comes out, some breaking story, something that's very inflammatory or otherwise is getting a lot of buzz, just all of a sudden, splash, there it is. Generally, I will wait for a couple of days and look for as many other resources as possible just to see what's another angle on this and is this telling the whole story before I will even so much as comment on it. And that puts me behind the curve. I know there's a lot of competition. Well, I want to be first. I broke the story. You heard this here first. I was number one in line. Remember that. That's great. But it sucks when you get something wrong and you have to walk it back, and that's happened to me, and I don't like it. I think it undermines your credibility, and credibility is one of those things that takes a long time to establish. It takes years or more to build up, and you can throw it away with just one bad take that you jumped into without looking. So I like that time to reflect, combined with things like being aware of nuance, taking a look at history, doing your own research. I also like looking for reliable sourcing. Now, that doesn't just mean sources that agree with me. That means looking for sources that can back up what they're saying. And oftentimes you'll find that some of the voices that are more reliable are not going to be the ones that are broadly accepted by the mainstream. So even people who are being marginalized, I like to examine what they have to say and judge for myself. And I know this is going to sound like a flex, but I'm going to tell you anyway. It took me a long time to get to where I felt like I can trust my own reasoning, or I can trust my ability to make up my own mind. You and I have been taught since we were very young, no, you can't. You need someone in authority to hand you truth because that's the only place you're ever going to get it. And I say that's a bunch of baloney. Truth is not something given to you by someone in authority. Truth is something you and I have to be able to think out and suss out and search out for ourselves. So why don't more people do it? There are various explanations. I think the path of least resistance is probably the most reasonable explanation. But it's hard work. So it really comes down to the question, how badly do you really want to know the truth? And if it's badly enough to go searching for it on your own, well, congratulations, my friend. You are definitely on the right path.
This is the Bryan Hyde Show.